Hello and welcome to today's webinar on dealing with the new normal technical solutions. Before I hand over to our moderator, Brendan Hammond, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping rules for you. It is best to access the webinar via Chrome or Firefox. Unfortunately, if you are logged in via Internet Explorer, then you may not be able to access all the features. During the webinar, please feel free to ask questions either via the chat or the questions tab. We will be monitoring this and then we'll be asking our presenters to answer these at the end of the webinar. If we do happen to run out of time and don't get around to your questions, don't worry. Any unanswered questions will be answered post-webinar. After the webinar, we shall be also making the link to the recording plus any questions and answers, and any useful information on our website. We will be circulating this link to you afterwards. Now I will hand over to our moderator, Brendan Hammond.
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon to all of you taking the time to join us today for what is our fourth webinar in a series focused on dealing with some of the challenges that organizations are having to deal with as a result of the COVID crisis. The previous webinars that we've done have provided some really great insights into some of the challenges being faced by many organizations and how to take proactive steps in dealing with these challenges. So if you missed any of our last webinars, they are available on our website. I would highly recommend having a look back at them because there's some really good practical information and advice on there. So moving on to today's topic, which is about what technical solutions can help you in the new normal. I think it's worth mentioning that due to GemServe's health expertise combined with our cybersecurity expertise and how those two practices in our business are integrated and work very closely together, we've been in the fortunate position to assist a lot of our clients within the health sector to navigate through some very trying challenges. But I won't say any more about this, as I think it's going to be touched on in some of the upcoming presentations. So I think that's probably a good segue into introducing our subject matter experts who are on the panel today. So we've got Ian Carr. Ian is our director from the GemServe Health Division. So Ian, I don't know if you want to give a quick overview of your background.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and a pleasure to be here. As Brendan said, I'm part of our health practice, and my background stems nearly 20 years now across health and care, and a number of developing technology solutions, deploying solutions and services. And so we've been able to put together some unique insight built on the combined experience of the team, which we'll share with you shortly.
Thanks very much, Ian. We've also got Ian Rutland, who is one of the principal consultants in our cybersecurity team. So over to you, Ian.
Yes, hi, good afternoon to you. Thank you. Within GemServe, I'm a principal consultant within the cybersecurity team, part of the wider security and privacy team. And it's my role to try and ease and assist clients and customers through the myriad of security issues that they're going to find in the new normal. And background-wise, I've been dealing with security for probably about 30 years now, initially in the military, but then through the private sector into GemServe today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. And last but certainly not least, we have Andy Green. So Andy heads up our cybersecurity delivery at GemServe, as well as being our CISO and the acting CISO for other organizations. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Brendan. Great to be here again. To pick up on the points that were just raised by Ian and the other Ian, it's a unique insight that we have by having practices which have deep subject matter experts within various different sectors, as well as technology expertise. And so I'm privileged to be the CISO of GemServe. We're about a 200 consultant organization, which crosses many different practices. And so securing our own organization has presented numerous challenges in the current crisis. But also, as mentioned, I'm one of the managing consultants for our internal security function, which then provides capability out to our external clients. So I'm working at the moment within central government, providing guidance there as to how to mitigate these challenges. And so what I hope to do over the course of this webinar is to bring some actionable insights that you will be able to use when addressing the technology changes and the technology challenges with dealing with the COVID crisis. Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks, Ian and Ian. So we're going to move on to Ian Carr's piece first. So as I said, Ian is the Director of Health. Ian's going to give an overview of what's been happening in the health sector, which is very relevant at the moment, obviously due to the health crisis that we're in, and also how GemServe has been able to assist with some of these challenges. So if you have any questions as we move through the presentations, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Michelle will pass them on to me, and then I will put them to the speakers. Okay, thanks very much. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Brendan. So I'm going to take a few minutes just to cover some of the insights even that we've gained since the beginning of the year as we've started to track and observe the impact of COVID-19. If we remember back to December 2019, January, we're only really starting to hear about this term, and it was affecting other parts of the world, but not necessarily interrupting our daily lives, how times have changed. So just a little statement here, that the fight against COVID-19 to date has really been focused on the immediate threat and the relief from that threat. This relief phase will continue until COVID-19 has been eradicated, but we can't just wait, if you will. So national and local leadership recognize the need to start planning for a recovery and then that development phase sooner rather than later. So to help frame our thinking, we thought it'd be helpful to gather our thoughts, and we pulled them together into this graphic that hopefully you can see now on your screens. The journey to the new normal, as we call it. And this is to help articulate how we see the phases of the pandemic playing out. So we could develop strategies to help our customers during this time of immense pressure, unprecedented change and stress. Really difficult time for many of us as we're all going through. So if we look at part one, the relief phase or the crisis phase, so we've been working with our healthcare customers from my division and my colleagues in their other divisions through this phase of the pandemic. And in hindsight, this has actually shared a lot of aspects that we would see with relief efforts from natural disasters. So protecting life, maintaining continuity of services. So from a health perspective, we've been focused on ensuring the ongoing delivery of health transformation by successfully switching from our programs. Typically we're on site with our customers, so now we're working remotely and still delivering. But also directly supporting the crisis response and helping develop NHS Nightingale Hospital capacity across the east of England. That's been a real interesting project for us to be working on. So I think it's clear to say now that we've moved into the recovery phase from this initial relief effort. But this is it's a fine balancing act, health versus wealth, as the country starts to plan to see how we coexist with COVID-19 until a vaccine is found, or if it's found. And we're starting to see this now at the moment as our politics plays out. If this is left unchecked, we would expect to see some outbreaks on a national or regional level, multiple waves of relief and recovery continuing well into next year. So we're at a really important time on how we manage our recovery phase going forward. Between each of these waves, you will see the health services trying to catch up with an ever-increasing backlog of care. Remember, basically the hospitals closed business to normal care back in March. Well, that backlog is ever increasing with the cancelled elective work and new diagnoses. People are just not presenting to hospitals with strokes, cardiovascular diseases, obesity, diabetes, etc., etc. And we're also going to see increases in mental health issues as further demand is hit in an already strained and underfunded system. And we need to learn the lessons. We have to be careful that we learn the lessons of previous pandemics, 1918, 1920. It's a long time ago, but we can't come out of lockdown too quickly and continue life as it is. So what can we do as a government? What can we do as a society? Well, more of the same, really. It was clear that social distancing had a clear impact, a positive impact on flattening the curve. That's been no doubt. Drug development, both for treatment and cure, are key, but they could take another 12 to 18 months. So as we move into this outbreak containment phase, as you can see in the graphic, a lot of our strategy will be based on the reproductive number. So reproductive number based lockdowns on a regional and local basis. mass testing for the disease itself or for antibodies, so those who've had disease were asymptomatic, and mass contact tracing. So technology can really play a vital part here. And we may even see the need to combine both of these together, the mass test tracing and the contact tracing and mass testing. This may also provide some issues around existing privacy laws, which we'll have to deal with as and when they arise. We'll continue to need to shield the 1.5 million at-risk people. How do we keep them safe in their home? Well, technology has a key part to play here in creating a safe environment, using assistive technologies, using the smart home. We've already seen examples here of governments, cross-government thinking to ensure that vulnerable people, as an example, do not have their power supplies disconnected. Previously, departments would have operated in silos, so it's really nice to see people working during these times of crisis together. So as we continue to embrace the new normal, we're all familiar with that term now, working from home will continue. We'll see collaborative technologies. Great example have been the rollout of MS Teams, Microsoft Teams across the NHS. Typically, we could hazard a reasonable guess and suggest that may have taken years. In fact, it took 4 days to roll it out across the whole NHS. So real great example of a transformation program there, working really well. Technologies will be embraced further and better by our GPs, as we can see now on online consultations, outpatient services moving to telehealth, all really positive things, and technology having a key role to play. Of course, all of this driven to keep us distributed, very important during these times. So as we move to the rebuilding phase, we're working very closely with our customers to help them maintain what they're currently doing, but also restart healthcare services to deal with those backlogs and that demand that's building up. We're working hard to make sure that any changes our customers have made during the crisis phase, we're able to re-engineer those so they can become long-term sustainable good processes and procedures. And we're talking across our health system customers about strengthening their cybersecurity approaches as more technology is adopted to offer services remotely to patients. And we'll continue to have a strong voice on balancing between privacy and living with the virus around contact tracing. So much of this new normal is technology enabled, that's clear. As we move further into the recovery phases, cybersecurity and data protection move ever closer to the top of our risk registers, both in health and both in our wider society. So I'll pause there and I'll hand back to Brendan.
Ian, thank you very much for that. One of the things that stood out there for me is that the transformation that the NHS is making, and that they're transferring at a rate never really seen before, which is great. But this must increase the risk of cyber vulnerabilities and wrong choices at times when it comes to technology, due to maybe the usual rigor not being applied to decisions and technology being procured that isn't never used effectively. So there's obviously the risk of that. Have you seen this in sort of the work you've been doing, and how can these organizations safeguard against these sort of practices?
Yeah, I mean, that's an observation we've certainly seen quite a lot across our customer base and the market as a whole. Sometimes to roll out technologies on a scale that we've seen our customers and our regulators dropping the benchmark slightly. So letting stuff get implemented, but certainly with a strong view that we will re-engineer, and those processes and technologies that have been put in place during the time of crisis will have to meet those strict IG and compliance regulations when we come back or come out of this. We're doing a lot of work in that space at the moment, Brendan.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. So, what other challenges have you been seeing within these organizations around, trying to procure and effectively use these sort of technologies?
I think with any technological program, it's change management. Really, it's changing cultures, it's changing people's behaviors. And typically what we would see during any mass rollout of technology would be a lot of effort will be given to changing attitudes and behaviors and then embedding that culture. If you will, this crisis has shortened that, if you will. People have been on board. There's a common cause, there's a common goal to move, surround and move towards. So that's been certainly a positive. But I think as we move through the phases, there will be lots of opportunities for organizations to look at the changes that they put in place and then revisit and ensure that they are compliant going forward.
Yeah, I think I would add to that what we've seen, and going back to the first question as well, Brendan, that we're seeing that organizations are, in order to survive, they're having to deploy architectures that in pre-crisis times, they might have gone through a more rigorous change control and a more rigorous risk management process prior to deployment. But inevitably, the organizations need to adapt to survive, and they need to be able to support the remote working activities that this crisis is demanding. And therefore, they're utilizing technology that perhaps wasn't designed for this purpose. So a good example would be making use of employees' own IT assets as opposed to corporately provided IT assets, or using platforms that aren't enterprise grade, for example. So using video conferencing platforms that were never designed for enterprise grade, so they don't necessarily have the security built in. And I think we've all probably seen the discussions around the security of numerous high-profile video conferencing platforms. And that users themselves, not only is the organization in some instances hamstrung by this very quick turnaround and the need for very quickly deployed capabilities, but also users. We've seen, and we discussed this actually on an earlier webinar, that users are having to adapt working practices, either because of their lack of awareness, perhaps, of corporate policy about the fact that these platforms, so for example, users using their own personal applications to share data, so using social media, for example, to share corporate information. So essentially just getting the work done by any means that they can. And that could be attributed to the fact that their lack of awareness around the fact that that is breaking corporate security policy, or there simply is no other way to achieve their objectives. And so in this period, what we're seeing is that organizations are operating outside of their risk appetite. So where there is a risk appetite, which has been defined, and I know that Ian is going to come on to discuss this, although I think he's having internet challenges as he's dropping in and out, Ian Rutland. Not all organizations have a clearly defined risk appetite, but also where there is a risk appetite, i.e. a tolerance for the amount of risk that the business is capable or willing to absorb, sometimes they're having to operate outside of that. So that's presenting a significant challenge. And what we're seeing, the conclusion of that, is that cybersecurity breaches are far more likely to happen. And if they do happen, the impact of those cybersecurity breaches could be far more significant.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Andy. So you touched there on the sort of the interaction of the people with data and systems within an organization. So organizations are having to adjust their risk appetite, but with an organization who has a specific risk appetite and a specific risk plan, how do they decide on how far they can adapt that risk appetite without it being a serious compromise to the business?
Well, I mean, risk appetite is obviously it's a construct to allow an organization to assess their posture in terms of risk, and perhaps more importantly, so that they can communicate internally to their stakeholders what is an appropriate level of risk that they should be operating in. Obviously, no organizations operate in a vacuum, so all organizations have an appetite for risk, at some level. And to put it into a real world context, for example, we all have an internal risk appetite, whether or not we explicitly understand it as that. So when you go to cross a road, for example, you will assess whether or not you'll cross at a busy junction or you'll go to the zebra crossing because of your appetite for risk. Now, you have an inherent appetite. Some people are more risk adverse and seek to avoid risk, and some people are more risk hungry. So we all know adrenaline seekers who will take what for others are significant risks just as part of their day-to-day activity, or they're seeking out fun, if you like, or seeking out activities to do. But that risk appetite is not set in stone, in so much that in different circumstances, so going back to that very simple analogy of choosing somewhere to cross the road, you may be quite risk adverse and always seek to cross at a zebra crossing, for example. But in certain times where there is a need, where the need changes, so you're in a hurry or there isn't the opportunity to use that facility, that control, if you will, that security control, then your risk appetite will flex. And it's the same in organizations. Organizations typically use the concept of a risk appetite so that they can define how much risk they're willing to take, and consequently, how many security controls they need to put in place to reduce the risk that the organization is facing down to a tolerable level. And that depends on the industry that they're in, the opportunities that are facing them, etc. But the organizations, and what we're seeing in this context, is that organizations are having to flex that appetite to enable them to continue to operate in this completely changed environment. So going back to the very simple analogy of somebody crossing the road, they're now, you know, the zebra crossing is no longer available. They're going to have to cross at a busy junction, if you like, because there's no other operating alternative currently.
Thanks, Andy. I'm not sure that Ian Rutland is still with us. He seems to be having internet connection. So
I think his risk appetite for presenting at webinars is risk averse.
Yeah, I'll ask you another question, sort of from your personal perspective, Andy. You worked as a CISO for a number of organizations. How would you balance the cyber security risk appetite with the wider organizational appetite? You know, when conflicts arise, which you know, they inevitably will, between business risk and cyber risk, how can people work to get a single view of consensus?
That's a great question. So there's several points that spring to mind. Firstly, that cybersecurity is a relatively embryonic discipline. And so cybersecurity risk appetite is not particularly well understood, and practitioners within the industry are still a relatively small subset of professionals in this space, whether it be, if you look at cybersecurity as a security discipline or an IT discipline or a management discipline, there are still not that many well-rounded, if you like, practitioners who understand both risk, technology, and so on. So often we see that security operates perhaps without taking into consideration risk. So the first point would be that that organizations need to ensure that they have a cybersecurity risk discipline within their capability. It's not purely a technology-led function. And then secondly, a key point is that it needs to integrate, as you were alluding to there perhaps, with the overarching enterprise risk management. So organizations are adept at managing risk in a number of different other functions. So they typically have an enterprise risk function which looks at the operating risk for the organization. You typically also see very mature risk capabilities within financial sectors, financial teams and functions, and within project management teams. So within PMO offices and program and project management, there's a well-defined risk management capability for delivering that particular project or program. And cybersecurity risk needs to integrate with the enterprise, the overarching enterprise risk management capability, and also with those other pockets of risks, both to find allies to ensure that the messaging and the risk is well understood across the organization, but also to align. Risk management is often subjective in its assessment of risk. And so if a risk assessment is undertaken at year one, it needs to have an element of repeatability so that it can be undertaken with a similar methodology and process in years 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, so that you can determine if there are trends there and identify that you are treating risk in a consistent way. If you change methodologies, for example, from year to year, then the findings from one year to the next will not necessarily align and dovetail, and consequently then you won't be able to determine whether or not your risk is actually being reduced over, you know, if you've got a risk treatment plan which straddles multiple years, that you're accurately tracking that risk is being reduced. And so if you have a cybersecurity risk function which isn't integrated with the overarching enterprise risk management capability, then there is a risk that excuse the pun, that the risk methodology will change as you get new security managers, for example. If it's not driven from the top down, from the enterprise risk management and aligned with that, then like I say, if that changes, then it diminishes some of the value that you ascertain from having year-on-year robust risk management.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. So I suppose that's probably a good segue into you sort of presenting your piece to us, as it looks like Ian is not going to be joining us. So if you're happy to go ahead with that now, then you can do that.
Yes, thanks very much. And I think if we've still got Ian's slides, then I'll make an attempt at running through these. I didn't create the slides, great. So I may miss some of the points. But from the discussions that I had with Ian prior to the webinar, what we're looking to illustrate here is that the organization needs to understand its risk appetite, and it's often one of the least well understood components of risk. If I try to stress why it's so important, risk as a concept requires some kind of risk management. So once you've undertaken a risk assessment and the organization identifies how much risk it's facing, typically that will be provided as a prioritized risk list, then risk management decisions or risk treatment decisions need to be made as to what the organization is comfortable and how it's going to manage those risks. So some of those options are that they assign the risk, for example, by using insurance to underwrite it. The risk can be accepted, i.e. it's been identified that there's a significant risk in undertaking a particular course of action. In this case, with COVID, having all the users working remotely, for example, and the business, as we're saying currently, is that they have no option but to accept that risk. The organization can seek to avoid the risk, i.e. by not undertaking the risky course of action because the risk may be too challenging for the business and outside of the organization's risk appetite. Or most commonly, the organization can seek to reduce the risk. And this is what we tend to mean when we say risk mitigations. And those risk mitigations are in the forms of controls that the organization will put in place to reduce that risk down. So those are things like technical controls. So they can be things such as firewalls, antivirus, intrusion detection systems, for example. They could be in the form of policies. So those will be the management's direction encoded into a set of, or codified into a set of best practices for the organization to follow to align and meet business objectives. And obviously there's personnel controls. So greater levels of security awareness, for example, or ethical phishing training so that people aren't susceptible to the threats that they're facing. And all of those security controls are used in concert together. So you get a program of security mitigating controls, which will seek to reduce the risk which has been identified as part of your risk assessment. Now, you can't reduce a risk down to zero. There's always some what's known as residual risk after those controls are applied. But the organization needs to apply those risk controls down to the level that it's comfortable that the residual risk is a tolerable amount of risk, that the organization can continue to operate with a level of risk which is acceptable to the board and to the management. And that's the level of risk appetite. Now, that's an internal decision that an organization can make themselves. You know, it involves the stakeholders. So if they're publicly listed, then it would be the shareholders of the business. If they're a private organization, it would be the board of management or the organization's owner. But ultimately, the organization can seek to set their appetite pretty much where they see it is appropriate for their business. And by appropriate, that appropriateness can be according to the legislative and regulatory framework that the organization operates within. But as we were talking about previously about an individual, or some organizations are very risk hungry. So we often see that startups, for example, may be very risk hungry in so much that they're willing to accept far greater levels of risk in order to create a proposition and to carve out a new market for themselves. And so they'll take decisions that much more established organizations would consider to be too risky. And then that goes down into a sliding scale down to organizations that are very risk adverse. So those organizations might be heavily regulated, perhaps in the financial sector, or indeed in the healthcare sector, whereby you're dealing with highly sensitive and regulated data. And so those organizations will seek to not accept very high levels of risk. And so the organization setting a risk appetite and communicating that out to not only the risk practitioners, but also to the rest of the organization, perhaps not in the language of this is our risk appetite, but this is what is acceptable behavior, for example, and educating the staff so that they are via policies, etc., so that they are operating in a way which doesn't conflict with that organizational risk appetite is the key point. And then the organization applies those controls to a point, and a risk practitioner such as myself and the team at GemTALK will work with an organization to assess the risk, define what the risk appetite is, and give an organization a risk mitigation plan which will allow them to track the mitigation of those risks to a level which is below the appetite. Now, why this is pertinent today on this webinar, when we're talking about the change in working practices at the moment with the COVID crisis, is that organizations, by virtue of the fact that they're having to accept new ways of working, are now operating outside of that risk appetite. And what that is leading to, as well as the increase in the number of threats, is, as I mentioned, a greater potential for security breaches. And in that instance, then sometimes the impact of those breaches can be significantly higher. Now, what we see in our experience, if you like, and with the clients that we work with, is that organizations tend to engage us from a security perspective as a result of two different drivers, if you like. One is that they have pain points. So those pain points are, for example, that they suffer a cybersecurity breach or a data protection breach. They may also fall foul of some regulation, perhaps as a result of that breach. Or they may, for example, have an audit, and that audit doesn't return the expected results. So those pain points then drive that organization to then contact us to reassess their risk position and to invest in some security capability. The other is that they have some kind of an organizational trigger. So that could be, for example, that the organization is going through a merger or an acquisition or a divestiture where the size of the company is changing. Or that there is a change in the industry. Perhaps there's new legislation, as we saw in May 2018 with GDPR, for example, was a significant trigger for a lot of organizations to implement additional security controls. And obviously the COVID crisis is one of these events which is causing organizations to look at their security. Now, what we see, unfortunately, in some of these events is that organizations respond in, if you like, a knee-jerk way, in so much that their security acquisitions and their procurement decisions are based on quite short-term tactical decision-making, as opposed to looking at a longer-term, more strategic, risk-based view. And that's why Ian was talking about risk appetite and the need for an organization to understand what their appetite is, and consequently, what is a strategic risk decision. So instead of being presented with the need to have more VPNs to enable remote working and rushing out perhaps to buy a technology solution to that, is to have a look at the strategic view, have a look at the risk that the organization is facing, have a look at the organization's risk appetite, and making a more balanced view, which gives a more rounded and ultimately effective security posture. So I think we can probably move on to Ian's next slide. I think I probably covered off everything that he was talking around.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yes, please do.
From the audience, actually. So one of them is, I agree that cybersecurity risk management is a part of enterprise risk management, but should not management of risk be a constant process rather than carried out annually?
Yes, I think it's a very good point. We advocate that there are multiple points where risk is undertaken. So you have an initial risk assessment at the beginning of your risk journey, if you like, and that initial risk assessment tends to be very comprehensive and considering the entire gambit. And this is where, from a cybersecurity, as I was mentioning, it's a relatively embryonic discipline. Some organizations are yet to instill a cyber security risk management capability. And at that initial risk assessment is where you would seek to align your risk approach with the enterprise risk management as an overarching, and the other areas of risk within the organization, perhaps project risk and so on. We would then state that realistically you should have at least an annual risk assessment to maintain the visibility of the risks, but that would be the maximum. You should also be considering undertaking a risk assessment if there's any substantive change in the risk position. So that could be after a significant change management initiative, or after a cybersecurity breach, for example, which has changed the context that the risk assessment has been undertaken within. And so, although we're stating they should be done at least annually, there are many different points over the course of that year, over the course of that annual period, where risk assessments we would recommend that risk assessments would be undertaken. And those risk assessments typically can be done in a more lightweight, or in the sort of parlance of government risk assessment, in a snapshot risk assessment, so that they're not as comprehensive or time consuming, but will feed into the initial risk assessment and then the annual updates to that risk assessment. So I hope that answers the question for our viewer.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Another question actually from another member of the audience. So, in terms of risk appetite and the subsequent risk assessment, how would you advise organizations to build this sort of consideration into their risk appetite and risk assessment process without making those processes so unwieldy that they become seen as a negative in the business rather than an enabler through the assurance they provide?
It's a great question, and it's not one which I think has been adequately answered generally in the industry. So there are, not only is risk poorly understood and is often seen, as the audience member has identified, as an inhibitor, or perhaps something which is overly onerous or too process driven. But also there are many conflicting approaches as to what is the correct way of doing it. So one example would be that some practitioners would advocate that you take a quantitative approach to risk, very similarly to the way that you would do in a financial risk calculation or insurance, for example, whereby you use empirical evidence and actual numbers, if you will, actual metrics, to give you very accurate number-based risk output, i.e. perhaps the financial cost of a cybersecurity breach. Whereas other practitioners advocate having a more qualitative risk approach, where you're just assessing risk on a high, medium, and low basis, or like a RAG status, perhaps, which is far easier to achieve, perhaps, because it can be done via interview and engaging with the stakeholders across the business, but inevitably is far more subjective than a qualitative assessment. And so there is no agreed single approach. Equally, we do some risk assessments, for example, that can take 9 months from start to finish with very complex organizations such as financial services or government departments. And I would argue that perhaps they are too unwieldy to deliver value and not to be seen as risk for risk's sake, perhaps. At the other end, we have some methodologies that we use which are essentially captured on a single piece of paper, which are a series of 10 questions, each of which has got a binary yes or no answer, which will give a very short snapshot risk assessment. And the assessment can be done with a small group of stakeholders and delivered as just in one workshop. So there are ways to streamline the process. I think that as with all areas of cybersecurity, the key to it is to present it using language that the stakeholders understand. So not using the language of risk and not using the language of cybersecurity to present the answers, but using the language of the business. So the risk assessment shouldn't be a risk assessment for simply the sake of risk, but rather to inform the business about what are sensible investments into cybersecurity, or a sensible approach to delivering the business objectives. So in this case, for COVID, that will be how to best achieve remote working, or how best to minimize the risks or the change in risk landscape as a result of the COVID crisis. And so I think as long as the risk, whichever methodology you use, as long as that is then the output is delivered aligned with the business objectives, and it's delivered to the business executives, to the management and the board in a way that they can understand and use it to empower them to make decisions, then it's achieving its aim. Ian, would you have any view from the healthcare perspective?
Hi. Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I think that would resonate well, and particularly from a clinical perspective as well. We would agree with pretty much everything you said there, Andy.
Great stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, and I've got a quick question for you. Andy talked earlier about depending on the risk appetite of the organisation, and with the NHS, there's traditionally been quite a low risk appetite. So with them having to change things at pace at the moment, how are they managing that cultural change within the people in the organisation?
Yeah, it's a good question, Brendan. I think we would always say they're very risk averse. That traditionally would have been the view. That said, from a clinical perspective, clinicians have always been trying to drive forward change. I think regulations perhaps we use sometimes as a way to have a lower risk appetite, as we've discussed. But the crises, I suppose, has shown that they can move forward. It doesn't mean they've not followed their policies and procedures. It doesn't mean that they're not compliant, but it's just a breath of fresh air, I suppose. And I think we'll see going forward now, if you try to compare healthcare to banking, whereas I can get my money on my app and see where it's going. My health record, it's kept in paper files across many different organizations. So we'll see going forward the adoption of the digital first agenda in health. I think we'll see that rapidly coming to finally where we'll get to our kind of patient record on our phone within the next 5 years, I would say, and hopefully sooner. So yeah, an organization with a very low risk appetite and now due to a crisis has got a little taste of risk and is moving forward very quickly with a number of programs.
Sure. I suppose we'll see in the sort of the coming months and years post COVID whether these things are maintained or not. Thanks, Ian. Andy, if you want to carry on with that, we'll move on to your next piece.
Yeah, let's move on to the technology piece then. So what we've discussed thus far, just to recap, is that Ian's given us a very lucid understanding of how the crisis is likely to play out. The potential scenarios and the cadence, if you like, of the outbreak, and consequently what the likely impact to organizations operating will be. Ian Rutland was giving us an overview of how that then manifests itself in terms of the organization's risk appetite, and the fact that having an understanding of your risk appetite and consequently how to reduce your risk down to a level which is acceptable to the business whilst dealing with that new normal circumstance that we're all facing. And then I was then coming on to talk about some of the technologies that we can use to look at this. And specifically, I've just got 2 slides here to talk around one of the perhaps a buzzword which is being bandied around in the cybersecurity space at the moment, which is zero trust. And to give a bit of an oversight and hopefully some actionable insights that our audience can use to determine whether or not zero trust will be one of these sort of leading edge technologies that they can use to reduce their risk down to within their appetite. And the reason why I've selected that, I've only drilled down into one technology specifically because it's a relatively complex concept. So to not overly extend this piece of the presentation, so just to focus on this one area, but also in recognition that it is on a lot of organizations' roadmap, either to discover or to investigate further or to deploy. So some recent research that was undertaken by IBM showed that 70% of organizations have zero trust on their roadmap to deploy. So it is very much making inroads into people's strategic security investments. So what is it ultimately? And zero trust is a concept which has been coined as zero trust relatively recently, but it's been around for far longer. So going back into the 90s, there was a drive towards deperimeterization, as it was called, by an organization called the Jericho Forum, who were a significant think tank, if you like, in this space. The organization has subsequently been morphed into another organization, but they were on the front foot in terms of advocating that the current paradigm of having a perimeter, if you like, which typically was at the perimeter of the network, had its flaws. So most organizations will recognize that concept of having a network with a network boundary, and the boundary is protected by a firewall and perhaps a DMZ where you've got trust boundaries. So outside of the network perimeter is untrusted. In the DMZ, where your web servers would be semi-trusted, so public access is permitted, but with some access rules, and then reaching back into the trusted zone, where perhaps your database servers would be in the trusted zone, you know, again, was protected by a gateway with firewalling and so on. And that paradigm for security has been the go-to architecture and the standard for a couple of decades now. And the zero trust architecture and the zero trust concept is the next stage in an evolution where the trust perimeter is being reduced from the perimeter of the network. So if we use the analogy of the network being a castle, and previously the security boundary around that was the moat and the drawbridge with just one point of entry, instead of having that network perimeter, reducing that trust boundary down to just the individual and the individual's endpoint. Now, the reason for that, and so that's the same as deperimeterization. So instead of having that perimeter, bring it to either the individual asset or the data set, for example. And the advantage of that is that it allows, or it meets the requirements and challenges that we're facing by users no longer always being requiring access to corporate assets from within the network. So previously, remote access was a very or a relatively less used approach to access corporate assets. So it was perhaps only those remote workers like sales professionals and road warriors, as our US colleagues might call them, who would perhaps be dialing remotely into a corporate organization. But now organizations' profiles are far more complex. So we often see that organizations are, they have multiple locations. So you'll have international organizations with offices all over the world. Remote access is now prevalent. So almost every user has the ability to remote into the assets. And obviously the other significant trend is that assets are no longer being stored on data centers in legacy, in organizationally controlled data centers, but out to the cloud. And all of those changes in the way that IT is used has meant that that previous architecture of using the network boundary as the enforcement point for the security controls no longer meets the requirements of the organization. So by moving that boundary to the endpoint, and by zero trust, what we mean is not trusting any network, essentially. So even the corporate network is considered in the same way that a coffee shop network or an airport network would be. They're completely untrusted. The trust boundary sits around the endpoint. By moving the trust boundary to that area, then we're able to provide far more granular policy-based control of what each user is able to access. And effectively, then, that gives us far greater security control and the ability to meet the challenges that we've been presented with in this recent crisis. So I'm working with a large government department who have over 6,000 endpoints and are very much high profile dealing with a number of initiatives which we'd all be familiar with. And we had deployed a zero trust architecture at that department for the very purposes that I was just mentioning. By virtue of the fact that they've embraced cloud-based technology, they use Microsoft Office 365. Their servers are hosted in Azure and Amazon Web Services, and they have remote access through all users. And so we had deployed zero trust for the benefit of providing granular security control under this new paradigm. What's happened now is that the crisis has hit, and we've had to leave the central Whitehall offices that the department is housed in, and we were able to overnight provide robust remote working with no impact to service at all. So it's been a significant success story in terms of meeting the challenges of COVID whilst providing far more granular security control. If we can move on to the next slide, please. That's great. And so then the zero trust architecture, and for those members of the audience who would like to know more, the best recommended, my best recommendation for good practice is from NIST, the US Organization for Standards and Technology, so the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They have a special publication, 800-207, which is still in draft, which recognizes the newness of this approach, if you will. But it's in the second iteration of its draft, and it gives a fantastic breakdown of, and vendor agnostic breakdown of zero trust architectures and how they can be deployed within your organization. And then so to put a bit more flesh on the bones, how does this help to reduce your risk within your organization? And I've captured what I think are the four most key and pertinent points here. So number one is that user devices and data are controlled even when they're outside the organization's perimeter. So not only to provide you with remote access in the same way that a VPN would do, but also by using policy-based enforcement, only allowing a device which has been authenticated and a user which has been authenticated to that device to access specific assets. And each user and each device can only see the resources that they're entitled to be able to see. And in that way, it prevents the ability of an attacker to move through the organization. Number two is around the fact that the new processes associated with the new ways of working that we're talking about in terms of the COVID crisis can be incorporated into those policies and enforced at those policy enforcement points. So if you consider a policy enforcement point for zero trust in the same vein as a proxy server in other security architectures, and the policies are applied at that point, and new policies can be added very quickly. So the organization can flex to these types of business continuity challenges far more quickly and effectively. The third point I touched on a moment ago about lateral movement between endpoints. Because each endpoint has an encrypted tunnel from it, all traffic goes through the encrypted tunnel through to the assets that the user is authorized to view. They cannot move laterally around the network, which reduces an attacker, one of the key ways to compromise an organization. So if anybody's familiar with the cyber kill chain, which follows obviously, as it sounds like, a military doctrine of an attacker's life cycle between when they do reconnaissance and get initial access onto a corporate device, they then seek to escalate their privileges, then move laterally through the network to where the valuable assets are, and then exfiltrate or get the data out of that corporate system back to their own servers. So if you can prevent the attacker from being able to move laterally between one asset, between one endpoint and another, or one server and another, then all the attacker is able to compromise is one user's endpoint, thereby minimizing the impact of an attack. And then fourthly, as we mentioned on the previous slide, perimeter defenses and organizations' perimeters are becoming increasingly complex, and that complexity is minimized when you deploy or the complexity of providing a security capability to defend that perimeter is minimized by moving the perimeter to the endpoint, as in with a zero trust architecture, which reduces the risks of misconfigurations on a highly complex set of perimeter controls, or if you've got a very complex and deperimeterized, decentralized perimeter, then authorized changes is a significant area of risk, as there are so many different point products, and a zero trust architecture can help to reduce those risks. So in summary, a zero trust architecture is one of the key technologies which organizations can embrace to empower them to work effectively and securely in the new way of working, in the new normal. It will be one of the security controls that will help to reduce the organization's risks down to a risk that's within appetite. And it is flexible enough to be able to cope with the cadence of change that Ian was talking about, that our insight into the health industry is providing us with. Back to you, Brendan.
Thank you very much for that, and it's very, very interesting. I've got another audience question. We've got about 4 minutes left, so a couple of brief questions. How does zero trust differ from other remote access VPNs?
It's a great point, and I didn't sort of drill down into that in depth, but remote access VPNs have been around for a long time. We know very notable vendors like Cisco and Juniper from a networking perspective, providing those types of capability, as well as VPNs, which are site to site, which encrypt all traffic between two offices, for example. Remote access VPNs are capable products which will protect the confidentiality and the integrity of data as it's communicating between a remote access user and the network, for example. But once the authorized user has got access to the network and connected to the network, then they can see all of the assets, they can see all of the file shares, they can see they've then got open access into the network, the same as if they were an insider inside the network. All it's doing is essentially extending the perimeter out to that user when they're remote. What a zero trust architecture does, which is superior, is it only allows, because it's policy based on a far more granular level, it only allows each user to be able to see the assets that they're authorized to see. So if you've got a malicious insider that's working on a VPN connection, for example, or an endpoint that's been compromised, they could then use the VPN connection to connect into the network and compromise the network in the same way as if they were sat at a terminal inside an office. With a zero trust architecture, the impact that an attacker or a malicious insider can leverage is far, far reduced. So it's taking VPN technology and developing it to the next level, if you will.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. I think due to time, we won't have any more questions now, but I just want to say to the audience, if you've got any other questions, feel free to contact us and we'd be happy to answer those, even if it's just for a chat to sort of point you in the right direction. I think there was another couple of slides you wanted to go through, Andy, on
there was just, thank you. Yeah, there was just one last slide, which was just to give our audience a view that we have created since the crisis a specific COVID-19 assurance capability. So if you're watching this and you've got any questions around zero trust, or indeed any of the other issues that were raised on the call, then by all means get in touch. And we have a capability which will allow you to do a very quick assessment of your current capability. We can incorporate within that an assessment, if you haven't already done it, of your risk appetite, and create a roadmap for you to reduce your risks down to an acceptable level, and thereby minimize the likelihood of you having a cybersecurity breach. And in the event of a breach, ensuring that the impact of that breach is reduced down to the minimum, so that the organization is protected as far as possible. And we've created that capability mindful that that IT teams and security teams are having to work remotely, so we can undertake that with the minimum amount of impact from the stakeholders within the business. So it's very much tailored to operating in this new normal.
Thanks, Andy. So just in conclusion from myself, I did touch on this already, but if you need any help in this area, we can provide you with some guidance or even point you in the right direction. And we like to think of ourselves as a consultancy that's going to first see if we can help you once we understand what the challenge is without asking you for large sums of money up front. So, if it's just some practical advice you want or some tips or chat about some of the challenges that you're having at the moment, please do feel free to contact us. Also, as I said in the beginning of this webinar, this is part of a series of webinars we're doing on how to manage the various challenges within the current COVID crisis. So please do look out for the links for that. We will also send you some links. And if you want to watch any of our past webinars, please have a look on our website where they are all situated. Thank you very much. Back over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you to our presenters. And apologies for the technical difficulties we had with one of them today, but I think we managed very well with our experts on the panel. As Brendan just mentioned, this is a series, so there are more webinars coming up every Tuesday afternoon. There will also be a link to the recording that's going to be posted up on our website with any useful information regarding this webinar. So thank you again for joining us today and have a great week. And I hope you can join us again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.